Hello everyone, I'm Nizzahon here for the Aether Hub, and Hour of Devastation was spoiled in full earlier today. This means that in a week we'll be able to be playing Sealed and Draft with the new cards. In this video I'm going to talk about my picks for the best commons and uncommons in each color in the set based on my first impressions. Cards at this rarity are usually the most important in Limited, since you're going to see way more of them than you will see rares or mythics. If you want to see a more detailed discussion of the cards in the set, over the course of the next week I'll be reviewing all 199 cards in the set over on my channel, NizzahonMagic, so check it out. Now let's get started by looking at the best white commons. I think the third best white common is Oketra's Avenger. It is a 2-mana 3/1. Those are basically pretty reasonable stats for an aggressive creature, but it also has Exert. And we've seen that Exert was quite powerful in the last set, especially in red-white decks, and Oketra's Avenger slides right into those red-white decks fairly well. When it exerts itself, damage to it is prevented. This means that it's basically impossible to block. Obviously, it eventually will lose its effectiveness in the game at one point or another, because your opponent will just be able to block it. Even if they can't kill it, they can block it. Although, if you're backing it up with combat tricks, this gets to be a pretty problematic creature. It isn't a card I would take super early or anything like that, but it is a card that I would be very happy to have in any white aggressive deck in this format. Next, we have Mummy Paramount, who is sort of the common white zombie payoff in this set, and I don't think it's quite as good as Binding Mummy, but it's a 2-mana 2/2 with upside, and it's frequently going to be a 3/3 when it's attacking, and that's perfectly fine. Again, don't really want to be taking it early either, but it's a fine card, especially if you're in a zombie deck. However, the best white common is a card I would be happy to first pick, and that is Sandblast. We've seen Sandblast before, back in Khans of Tarkir block, and it was very good there, and it's also very good here. It turns out, when you sort of upgrade Impeccable Timing by making it cost 1 more and adding more damage to it, up to 5 damage here, that's a big deal. That can kill almost any creature in the format, even when it's exerting itself, except for Oketra's Avenger, obviously, because damage is prevented. But the point is, Sandblast is a first pickable common. On the whole, white is not super deep at common in this set, which is probably okay, because in the third pack there's a bunch of ridiculous white commons like Gustwalker. But in this set, in the first 2 packs of this format, it's not the deepest in terms of commons, but these are all fine cards I'd be happy to have in any white deck, Sandblast being the most exciting of them. Let's look at white's uncommons now. I think the third best white uncommon is Steward of Solidarity, a 2-mana 2/2 that can tap itself and exert itself to make a 1/1 white warrior creature token with Vigilance. This is very good. It's a 2-mana 2/2 who can attack in the early game, and then in the late game it can start building your board for you wider and wider by making a white warrior creature token every other turn. Steward of Solidarity is the kind of card I feel fine about first picking. I'm not going to be overjoyed, but it's a solid, powerful card that I'd be happy to take with a first pick. Vizier of the True is the next best white uncommon. It's another exerter. It can exert itself, and when anything gets exerted, on your side of the table anyway, you get to tap a creature an opponent controls. Now, if you played the last format, you know that red-white aggressive decks and green-white aggressive decks were incredibly frightening things, and that was in part because of the exert mechanic, which made creatures incredibly difficult to stop in combat. Well, now they're going to be even harder to stop if your opponent has something like Vizier of the True, because every creature you exert will also tap down one of your opponent's creatures, enabling you to get in for even more damage. It's sort of another effect that makes it so blocking is irrelevant in this format, and Vizier of the True is incredibly powerful. Even on his own, he's a very good card, but obviously you want to be in an exert deck for him to be at his best, but it's not that hard to do. Exert's all over the place. We've already seen it in just this video so far, and Vizier of the True is one of the more powerful cards in the exert deck, because it can just win you the game on its own, and I'd be happy to first pick it. But Desert's Hold is the best white uncommon. I would be very, very happy to first pick it. It's a very good removal spell. It's Arrest, basically, meaning a creature can't attack or block, or its activated abilities can't be activated. And all 3 of those are important, because sometimes you put a pacifism effect on a creature, but it can still use its activated abilities, and that's annoying. And then it's even better than Arrest. It's strictly better than Arrest, because if you have a Desert in play or in your graveyard, you also get to gain 3 life when you cast it, and that is very good. Deserts are all over the place in this set. We'll talk a little bit more about them later on in this particular video, but Desert's Hold is the best white uncommon and one of the best uncommons in the entire set. So white very deep at uncommon. All 3 of these uncommons I'd be happy to first pick, and there are tons of other uncommons in white that are good. The commons aren't quite as deep, but again, the third pack will sort of bail you out if you don't have a lot of great commons after the first 2, because it's really, really deep color in the final pack, the Amonkhet pack. Now, let's move on to blue. I think the third best blue common is Spellweaver Eternal. A 2-mana 2/1 with Afflict 2 and Prowess is a lot of stuff to have on one card that just costs 2 mana. Prowess is great. From looking at this set, it seems clear that the blue-red spells deck is going to be much more well supported here. It was supported okay in Triple Amonkhet, but it's way more supported in this new draft format with Hour of Devastation, making a card like this even better. And then you add a flick to the mix, and it makes things even more problematic. You know, when this creature attacks you and you're hoping you can block it with your 2/2 and kill it, and then your opponent uses prowess on it, and it kills your creature, and the afflict does damage to your opponent. That's some pretty crazy value, and it's not going to be impossible. There's lots of cheap spells in this format that can allow you to do that. It's not something I'd pick very early. I'd pick it up in the middle of the pack, though, and be pretty happy. The next best blue common, I think, is Aerial Guide. Now, this thing, I think, is really, really good, and in a weak pack, I'd feel fine first picking it. It's interesting because it wasn't a card that was spoiled ahead of time. It just sort of showed up today on the spoiler when it was fully revealed, and it's actually, I think, going to be a very powerful common. It's a Wind Drake, which is always a playable card, a 3-mana 2/2 flyer, but not only that, when it attacks, you can give another creature flying. And that's a big deal. If you are giving another one of your creatures an evasive ability, especially if it's a large creature, that's a big problem for your opponent. And Aerial Guide can represent a lot more than 2 damage in the air. And because of that, I like Aerial Guide a lot. I think it can close out games for blue decks effectively. And I think Aerial Guide is a very good common. And one I'd feel not excited, but fine about first picking in a weaker pack. And I would take multiple copies of it and be pretty happy in any blue deck. I think the best blue common is Unquenchable Thirst. For 2 mana, it does the usual blue removal thing, which is that the creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. However, if you control a desert or there's a desert in your graveyard, it also taps the creature. So if you have a desert in play, this becomes incredibly good. If you don't have one, it's sort of a medium removal spell, which is still something that you would take relatively early, especially if you're in blue. But it's not a great removal spell if you don't have deserts, so keep that in mind. You may end up with better removal in your other color and want to play it over Unquenchable Thirst, especially if you have 0 deserts. If you have a few deserts, Unquenchable Thirst really becomes powerful, though. Now, let's move on to the blue uncommons, the best blue uncommons. The third best blue uncommon, I think, is Eternal of Harsh Truths. Blue is pretty deep at common, as we saw, but I don't think it's as deep at uncommon as white was, and I think Eternal of Harsh Truths shows you that. It's a fine card. It's a 3-mana 1/3. It is a zombie, which is a relevant creature type, although mostly black-white cares about it. And it has a powerful effect. When it attacks and isn't blocked, you get to draw a card. That's cool, and it will work well in combination with the Drake we just looked at. Like, that's something I plan on doing in this format. Turning this Eternal of Harsh Truths into a Thieving Magpie and drawing a card every turn is awesome. It also has Afflict, so they did something pretty cool with the design on a lot of these Afflict cards, especially those at higher rarities of Uncommon, Rare, Mythic, and that is that you have to make a choice sometimes. Do you want to take 2 damage, or do you want to let your opponent draw a card? Because if you're blocking this with the 2/2, obviously you can't kill it. The problem with the Eternal, though, is it's just not very big. It might be able to attack for a little while, but unless you give it evasiveness, it's not going to get in for a lot of damage, and it's not really a card I love or would take very early. But it's an okay uncommon, and like I said, blue's not very deep at uncommon. Eternal of Harsh Truths is playable, but not exciting. I do think the top 2 blue uncommons are pretty good, though. The first of those being Ominous Sphinx, a 5-mana 4/4. You know, this format doesn't look like it's going to be quite as fast as the last one does, based on my first impressions. It's hard to say for sure, because obviously I haven't played with the cards yet, but it doesn't look like it's going to be as fast. So creatures like Ominous Sphinx, 5-mana 4/4 flyers are going to be better, and it comes with some nice upside. It's not just a large flyer who can win the game in the air at a good cost. It also can really wreak havoc on your opponent during combat. If you have 3 or 4 cards in your hand, your opponent has no idea how many of them have cycling or will allow you to discard cards, and it becomes very difficult for an opponent to attack into that. It's just not going to be worth it for them to attack if you shrink a couple of their creatures a lot of the time. And Ominous Sphinx, yeah, you have to sort of build around it a little bit to have it be at its best, but even in a vacuum, it's a 5-mana 4/4 flyer. I would be happy to first pick Ominous Sphinx. I do think 1 blue uncommon is even better, though, and it's one of my favorite cards in the set, one of the ones I'm looking forward to playing the most in Limited, and that is Vizier of the Anointed. So a 4-mana 2/4 is nothing special, but when it comes into play, you get to search your library for a card with Eternalize or Embalm and put it into your graveyard. That alone is pretty close to just being a 4-mana 2/4 that draws you a card, which is a pretty strong effect in general. I would play that card. But on top of that, anytime you Eternalize or Embalm something, you get to draw another card. So it sets you up with 1 creature with Eternalize or Embalm right away, and then if it's still in play, you get to start drawing cards. It can turn into a ridiculous engine, and Vizier of the Anointed is the kind of card that will just snowball, and if you're playing it, you're just going to eventually win the game because you're going to outvalue your opponent between getting cards out of your graveyard and not using cards in your hand and drawing extra cards. And that's just something that I love. It's a very grindy, powerful card that can block okay in the meantime. But like I said, putting an Eternalizer Embalmed creature into your graveyard is almost like drawing a card, because that card that's in your graveyard has an effect that you can play, so it's sort of like an additional card in your hand. And then again, it draws you a ton of cards. Vizier of the Anointed is awesome. It's one of the cards I'm most excited about, and I think it's also the best blue uncommon. Now let's move on to black. Black is another color not ultra deep at common, and you'll see that immediately because I think the third best black common is Ruin Rat. 2 mana, 1/1 with Death Touch, and when it dies, you exile a creature or a card, any card from your opponent's graveyard. That's perfectly fine. Death Touch creatures are nice. They can trade with anything. It has the problem of only being a 1/1 in a format filled with -1/-1 counters, but it also comes with the additional upside of letting you exile a card with Embalm or Eternalize or Aftermath or whatever when it dies, and I think that's perfectly fine. You'll play these in every black deck and feel good about it, but you're not going to really want to be taking it super early either. I do think the top 2 black commons are very powerful. It's just that after you get below the top 2, there's a pretty big chasm in power level between the rest of the black commons. I think the second best black common is Torment of Venom, which for 4 mana is an instant, and it says put 3 -1/-1 counters on target creature. That would already be a reasonable card and probably would have been enough to be like number 3 on this list, but it does more than that. It also does this sort of torment thing that's sort of a weird sub-mechanic or theme within this set where your opponent has to make a decision between losing 3 life, sacrificing an online permanent, or discarding a card. There's 3 different cards at different rarities in this set that do this. They're all mono black. And Torment of Venom is nice because it kills a creature, most likely, and then on top of that, it makes your opponent make a pretty difficult decision. If you're getting any of that extra value, whether they're losing 3 life, discarding a card, or sacrificing an online permanent, you feel pretty great about spending 4 mana for that, I think. So I think Torment of Venom is the second best black common. It's a good removal spell, and sometimes it'll just be backbreaking for your opponent. I do think there's one common that's even better, though, and it is Lethal Sting. This is another one that was just sort of sprung on us today. It wasn't one we saw way ahead of time, but it is a very powerful common. For 3 mana, you get to put a -1/-1 counter on one of your creatures, or you have to, I should say, but you also get to destroy a creature outright. 3 mana to destroy a creature straight up isn't something we see ever, really, in Limited anymore. Lethal Sting lets you do it, and yes, you have to put a counter on one of your creatures, but, especially in the black-green deck, -1/-1 counters aren't a huge downside. And a lot of the time, even if your deck isn't super synergistic, if you can put a -1/-1 counter on like your 1/2 mana dork or, you know, on a smaller creature that isn't really affecting the board anyway, killing your opponent's best creature for 3 mana and weakening one of your creatures is a great deal. Lethal Sting is first pickable. Torment of Venom, I think, is close to first pickable, but Lethal Sting definitely is. It's a very, very powerful common and a card that I'm going to be happy to have in any black deck that I build, but especially in a deck that can synergize with the -1/-1 counters, because that's just messed up. If you're taking away the downside of this card, it just gets to be ridiculous. So let's move on to the uncommons. So I think black is maybe the shallowest color when it comes to uncommons. As good commons as we saw, the top 2 were quite good, but in terms of uncommons, I'm not ultra impressed with really most of them. Torment of Scarabs is what I have at number 3 here. This is a difficult card to judge. It has that sort of torment effect again that we saw on the removal spell we looked at a moment ago, but Torment of Scarabs doesn't do anything else. All it does is every upkeep make your opponent make that choice. And that's not quite as good as doing something and then tacking the effect onto it, like putting 3 -1/-1 counters on something. But I do think Torment of Scarabs is the kind of card that really will become obnoxious for you or your opponent, whoever's cursed, because making that decision every turn eventually results in, like, you know, a 5-for-1, a 6-for-1, because you end up losing so many cards. Now, if your opponent's super far ahead of you, Torment of Scarabs isn't going to be great because they'll just lose 3 life every turn, not affect their board or their hand at all, and just keep killing you. And that's why I don't love the card a whole lot, but I think it has a lot of potential. I wouldn't be surprised if it's better than I think it will be. But I'm not ultra excited about it, but I would pick it up in the middle of the pack if I were a black deck. The next black uncommon, I think, is Vile Manifestation. Now, This also isn't the most exciting of cards, but it is a nice cycling payoff for cycling decks. And basically every deck is going to have cycling. I wouldn't take it early either unless it's clear you're going to be deep into cycling, especially in blue-black. That's where you're going to see the most of it. It itself has cycling, which is nice. So if you have no cards with cycling in your graveyard, you can just cycle your manifestation. But again, it's not actually that good of a card despite being an uncommon and making this list. It's just that black is not very deep at uncommon. However, black's best uncommon is incredibly good, and that is Bane Whip Punisher. So for 3 mana, it comes into play as a 2/2, and it puts a -1/-1 counter on a creature. Sometimes that'll just outright kill something, right? Well, in this case, it will for sure, because you can pay 1 black mana and destroy a creature that has a -1/-1 counter on it when you sacrifice Bane Whip Punisher. And you can do this at instant speed, obviously. So you can do all sorts of shenanigans with -1/-1 counters. It gets to be even better when you are putting multiple -1/-1 counters on your opponent's creatures, or if they're putting them on their own, because sometimes, like I said, you'll kill an X1 with just putting a counter on it, and then you can sack the Punisher to kill something else. So it's basically a very good removal spell with a body when you need it to have a body. And because of that, Bane Whip Punisher is a very powerful uncommon and one I would first pick, and is miles ahead of all the other black uncommons in this set, but it is very, very strong. So from there, let's move on to red. I think the third best red common is Puncturing Blow. So this thing's a little clunky. It is sorcery speed, and that's why I don't have it higher, but it is 4 mana to do 5 to a creature, and not only that, it exiles the creature. So this means you get around annoying things like Eternalize and Embalm, and that's, you know, a worthwhile thing to do, and it can kill a lot of creatures in the format. The only reason it's not higher on this list, as I said, is because it's sorcery speed, which makes it kind of clunky. And this format, while I think it will be slower than the last one was, I don't think it's going to be so much slower that you're always going to be wanting to tap out on your turn to play Puncturing Blow. But it can kill most things in the format, and it even exiles them, which is nice. So I think the next best red common is Kenra Scrapper. Now this is just sort of another card in the vein of the very aggressive red decks. It's a 3 mana 2/3 with Menace, which is already okay, but you can also exert it to make it into a 4/3 with Menace, and that's not an easy thing to block. You're going to get a lot of 2-for-1s, and if you have combat tricks to back it up, which most aggressive decks do, that can be a real problem for your opponent, as Menace often is. I like Kenra Scrapper a lot as just another aggressive creature for red-white, red-green style aggressive decks. But I think the best red common is Open Fire. It's the only one of these 3 I would first pick, although all 3 of them are pretty good. 3 mana to do 3 to a creature or a player is great. I mean, it's instant speed. This is, red always sort of gets like a common removal spell that there's not really much to say about other than, well, that's pretty good. And that's what Open Fire is here. But I would first pick it and feel fine about it. So before we talk about the red uncommons, I do have one that's sort of an honorable mention for red uncommons, and that is Sand Strangler. So this card in a vacuum is a very powerful card because of the fact that it can be Flame Tongue Kavu, basically. You can come into play and do 3 damage to something. Yes, I realize Flame Tongue Kavu does 4, but you have to have deserts in your deck for it to do that. If you don't have at least a few deserts in your deck, this card isn't very good. It's a 4 mana 3/3. That's all it is. But once you get a few deserts in your deck, I think Sand Strangler is one of the best uncommons in the entire set, and I think it's probably going to be worth first picking sometimes because it has such a high ceiling. And the floor isn't so low that it's terrible. I mean, it's a 3/3 for 4, which isn't great, but there are way worse things you could be doing. But I didn't want to put it on my list of best uncommons because I wanted most of them to sort of be good without extra synergies around, and Sand Strangler doesn't really do that for you. It's bad unless you have deserts. So let's go ahead and move on to the red uncommons, though. Just keep Sand Strangler in mind, though. It is a strong card. If you see it around late, it is a good sign. Red's open, and so are deserts. So I think the third best red uncommon is Fervent Paincaster. It's a 3 mana 3/1 who can tap and do 1 damage to a player. It can also exert itself to ping creatures. So of course, these sorts of effects are always powerful, dating all the way back to Prodigal Sorcerer. And this one can actually attack pretty hard when it needs to, if the board's empty or whatever. And then once the game sort of reaches a stall, it can just start trying to kill your opponent and start picking off tokens and things like that. I like Fervent Paincaster a lot. The only reason it doesn't make it higher is because it's only got 1 toughness, and that dies to basically everything in this entire format. I think the next best red uncommon is Abrade. This thing's good. I mean, it's a lot like Lightning Strike. Well, it can't hit players, but instead of hitting players, it can also turn into an artifact destruction spell. And there are problem artifacts around, like Oketra's Monument and things like that. So having the ability to destroy artifacts in your main board isn't a bad thing to have, especially when it's attached to a very efficient removal spell. 2 mana for 3 damage at instant speed. And I think the best red uncommon, and by the way, I think Abrade and Paincaster are both worth first picking. I think the best red uncommon is, well, not actually mono red, and that is Struggle to Survive. I decided to include it here because of the fact that, you know, usually on these split cards, there's sort of like 60% of the powers in the card you cast from your hand, and then the aftermath is maybe 40% of the power. Here it's like 98% of the powers with the red part of the card, and it's very, very powerful. We saw Stone Fury a couple blocks ago in Zendikar, Return to Zendikar block, and it was very good, and it costs 2 more mana than this, and they do the same thing. And it can kill anything. It's the kind of removal that scales as the game goes on, and because of that, you may as well think of it as a mono-red card. If you don't end up playing green, who cares? The survive half of this card is very rarely going to be relevant in a limited game of Magic. It's basically a mono-red card. You should pick it as if it's a mono-red card and not think, well, if I'm not playing green, I'm not going to play it. You will. Struggle is incredibly good. It's actually just the best red uncommon, even though it's only half of the card. But these are all very, very good uncommons. Red is very deep at uncommon. All 3 of these are good. And then you also have the Sand Strangler, who I think can push his way onto this list, depending on how easy it is to get your hand on deserts. So now let's move to green. I think the 3rd best green common is Oasis Ritualist. You know, blue-green especially was about ramping in the last format, and it didn't really work out most of the time because the format was too fast. But there is a lot more ramping around in this set, and again, I think the format is going to slow down a little bit with only 1 pack of Amonkhet. And Oasis Ritualist is a 4 mana 2/4 who can just ramp you and fix you. It adds 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, and that's great. If you have a reason to be splashing, like an off-color bomb or a gold card you really want to fit into your deck, Oasis Ritualist is the kind of card that can do it. And it can also exert itself to add even more mana. So it's the kind of card that's going to be amazing in ramp decks. It's one of the cards that, being at common, will enable ramp decks to, I think, be even better than they have been so far. I wouldn't necessarily first pick it. In fact, I wouldn't at all, but I would take it relatively early, around pick 5 or 6. I wouldn't feel bad about a Ritualist. I think the next best green common is Ambuscade. We've been sort of spoiled lately with Cartouche of Strength and fight effects like that. That one is one of the best we've seen, especially at common. Ambuscade's not anywhere near as good as that, but it is an instant speed fight effect, which is kind of nice. We don't see them a lot. It means you can use it in response to a combat trick to kill a creature and get a 2-for-1. The problem with Ambuscade that keeps it from being like incredibly good is that it doesn't pump your creature's toughness at all. So sometimes you're going to have to 2-for-1 yourself to get the 2-for-1, so it's really a 2-for-2 in the end. Your creature has to have decent power and high toughness to survive fighting something a lot of the time. So Ambuscade just sort of asks a lot more of you than a card like Cartouche of Strength does, which just you put on any creature and it's good, basically. But Ambuscade is quite good. Again, wouldn't take it first pick necessarily, but I'd take it pretty early. The best green common, though, is, fittingly, a creature. It's a 2 mana 2/2, Ronus' Stalwart, who, when it attacks, gets +1/+1 if you exert it, and it can be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. This isn't quite Gustwalker, but I think it's one of the best exert creatures at common in this set. I think maybe Gustwalker is the only common exert creature. Well, maybe Hooded Brawler too. Hooded Brawler is better too. But there's only a couple common exert creatures that are better than Ronus' Stalwart. This is the kind of 2-drop that's great in any green deck, and especially if you're going to be aggressive. And I would consider taking it early. After we saw how good Gustwalker was, and it's worth first picking, I think Ronus' Stalwart is sort of in that same neighborhood, though not quite as good. Green is sort of interesting at common. There's a lot of commons that are like, yeah, I'd like to have that in my deck, but none that are so good that I feel great about first picking them, I guess I would say. Ronus' Stalwart gets the closest. So let's move to uncommons. At uncommon, I think the 3rd best green card is Tenacious Hunter. So this is a 4 mana 4/4 at its fail case, and that's a very good deal. That's a large creature. But if any creature anywhere has a -1/-1 counter on it, not your board, your opponent's board, any board, it gets Vigilance and Death Touch, and that is a big problem. If you're playing a 4 mana 4/4 Vigilance and Death Touch, that is an amazing thing to have in play. Your opponent won't be able to attack through it easily, your opponent will be able to block it easily, and it's not that hard for -1/-1 counters to be around. They're going to be on your opponent's creatures. Sometimes they'll be there your opponent will put them there themselves. Sometimes you'll put them on your own creatures. Sometimes you'll put them on your opponent's creatures. If you're in green, there's a lot of ways of putting -1/-1 counters on things, and it gets to be even more so if you're green-black. But the reason Tenacious Hunter, I think, is good enough to make this list is because its fail case is still a 4-mana 4/4. And basically nobody but green gets 4-mana 4/4s below, rare or mythic. And so they're always very large creatures that aren't that easy to deal with. And this one comes with the added bonus of sometimes, and maybe more often than not, having Vigilance and Death Touch. The next best green uncommon, I think, is Hope Tender. This is another one that helps you ramp. Now, it's a 2-mana 2/2, so that's a nice thing to have. Most of the time, green decks are creature-based, right? And it can untap lands, but you have to pay 1 generic mana, so that's usually not really going to be worth it. It's not going to be the kind of effect that really makes a difference unless, say, you really need double red or something like that, and Hope Tender allows you to get that double red because it lets you untap your mountain again and tap it again. But where it really shines is when you exert it, and it untaps 2 lands. So this is another creature that ramps for you. It does have to exert itself, but it's a 2-mana 2/2 in the early game, and then in the late game it can ramp you into a big spell. I think the best green uncommon, though, is Overcome. We've seen Overrun before, and Overcome is a smaller version of that. It costs a little less green mana, and it gives a little bit smaller of a boost, but man, if your deck has 15 or more creatures in it, Overcome is going to win you a lot of games. Interestingly, I think kind of like green is a common, none of these uncommons are incredible. They're all good, though. They're all, not the kind of uncommon that it's like, that's one of the best uncommons in the set. I can't wait to first pick that. But Hope Tender and Overcome are both decent first picks, and even Tenacious Hunter is. They're just not amazing or anything. But Overcome, you have to sort of build around it for it to really work. You have to be a go-wide deck, maybe with a lot of tokens for it to be at its best. But I can tell you a lot of games are going to be won by Overcome in this format based on effects like that, like we've seen before in the past. So that does it for all of the colors. Before I sort of conclude this video, though, talking about the best commons and uncommons, I wanted to touch very quickly on the lands in this format and some of the better common and uncommon lands. So deserts are a thing. We saw that in this list, that there's lots of cards that care about deserts, and both of these cycles of deserts are very good. Desert of the Fervent is a cycling land. There's a card in every color, a land in every color that comes into play tapped, adds a colored mana to your mana pool, and can be cycled. These are all very good. Why? Because they're basically upgrades over your regular mountain being in your deck, even if you don't have desert synergies. This is because they keep you from flooding out in the late game. You can just cycle it away in the late game. Yes, in the earlier game it can be a little bit of a liability that comes into play tapped, but the value you get by cycling this away when you already have 6 or 7 lands is going to make up for that. And, by the way, lots of cards care about deserts. The deserts can even be in your graveyard, so cycling Desert of the Fervent means you have that desert trigger ready to go, and that's true of all of the deserts in this cycle. I like them all. I would feel fine about playing all of them. I would take them even, in the middle of a pack sometimes, especially if my deck is cycling or desert heavy. And then there's also the cycle of uncommon deserts that Hashep Oasis is a member of. These all add a colorless to your mana pool. You can pay 1 to add 1 colored mana to your mana pool, and they all have activated abilities where they sacrifice themselves. And most of them have activated abilities that are pretty nice. I mean, they're in the early game, these are basically mana rocks, and then in the late game, they turn into effects. Like giving one of your creatures +3/+3 is often enough to just make it so you can attack on a board you couldn't have otherwise. And again, having a desert in your graveyard, which is where this or another desert you sacrifice, because this can sacrifice any desert, getting a desert into your graveyard can trigger a lot of useful effects in this format. So that does it for this video on the best commons and uncommons in Hour of Devastation. In the comments, let me know what you think the best commons and uncommons are in this set. Let me know what you're most excited to draft. Again, if you want to see some more detailed discussion of all of the cards in Hour of Devastation, you can head over to my channel, NizzahonMagic, where I'll be doing a full set limited review over the next week. Also, don't forget to subscribe here to the Aether Hub for a lot of other great content, including Seibenlore, deck techs, and more of my limited content. So, thanks for watching.